day, so you've made it. Yeah, it's been a great conference, and so I just want to thank everyone for their participation today. I'll introduce myself. My name is Ricky Terra. I'm the Manager of Client Experience and Operations here at PSHSA, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this session called Building the Psychologically Safe and Supportive Workplace Post-Pandemic, presented by Christine Yip, Founder and Managing Director of Organizations for Impact. Before we begin, I want to mention that there will be an opportunity to answer a few questions following the presentation. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat, and we will select some to ask from there. COVID-19's impact on the workplace will be recognized for changing the way we work. It is key we have an understanding of how these changes unfold to better chart paths forward. Christine Yip is the Managing Director of Organizations for Impact, a management consultancy that works with leaders across sectors to build more supportive, inclusive, and psychologically safe workplace cultures. Her clients have ranged from grassroots not-for-profits to Fortune 500 companies. Christine has worked at both Accenture and KPMG's human capital consultant practices. She holds a master's in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Guelph and in social policy and planning from the London School of Economics. She is a board member for Toronto's Daily Bread Food Bank and West Neighborhood House. She also teaches various organizational behavior courses at Schulich School of Business. And so we are pleased to welcome Christine, who will reflect on lessons from the pandemic about caring for ourselves and others at work, and what this means for how we adapt our organizations for the future. Hello and welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Ricky. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, yep.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yep, okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Ricky. Thank you for everyone at PSHSA for having me today. And I didn't realize this was the last session of the day, so thank you everyone for attending today. I think that obviously we know this pandemic has brought a lot of change to how we work. We are now doing conferences at our homes, which is both nice, but also brings new challenges. But I think as the pandemic has sort of brought in a lot of these changes, obviously a lot of workplaces have really seen the importance of taking care of their employees' physical safety. But I think what also has sort of come out of all this is organizations, leaders, managers, employees, everyone is realizing the importance of also playing more of a role in ensuring sort of the psychological safety of workforces and teams across organizations, especially as we're going through this pandemic. So we really have an opportunity to really step back and sort of look forward and how are we going to take some of these lessons we've learned about the importance of building sort of supportive, caring work environments, and how do we sort of build this and bring the best parts of this into sort of that post-pandemic world. So this session is really intended to sort of step back and reflect on, what's been happening in the pandemic around sort of the requirements for a more supportive management approach and supportive workplace cultures, but also what was happening before the pandemic. Like most things in the pandemic, it really just highlighted some of the issues that were already there. I think from a workplace perspective, before the pandemic, there was a lot of issues already happening around well-being and burnout that, there was discussions about how do we get better at this, but the actual actions weren't necessarily meeting the need that was happening around people's sort of well-being at work and their stress levels at work. So hopefully we could sort of reflect on some of that and really sort of move forward and think about how would we make sort of that, what's that psychologically safe and supportive workplace of the future sort of really look like. So in this sort of 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to be, the objectives of my session or what I've put together for you guys is to reflect on the impact of the pandemic on our well-being in our workplaces, understand the drivers of well-being and stress at work, and that will help us outline what's the right path forward for building more psychologically safe workplaces. So hopefully that will sort of be able to sort of fuel some good conversation we'll be able to have after the session. So I do a lot of sort of big thinking planning sessions with my clients. So I thought I'd start this session in the same way. When we're talking about what does that psychologically safe and supportive workplace of the future look like? Or what does that better workplace of the future look like? I want to do a little bit of a visioning exercise, get everybody in the room to sort of put on their visionary hats or their imagination hats and say, if you close your eyes and picture yourself working 5, 10, even 30 years from now, or your kids or your nieces and nephews or whoever, what does work look like? What does a better workplace look like? So what is it, when you close your eyes and you picture that, what do you see around you? How do people interact? How do they treat each other? How are people collaborating? What are standard practices? Are people in the office? Are they at home? Is there a mix of both? Are we, do we have a 4-day work week? Like what is kind of that ideal place? And how is it better than today? What are the elements of it that make it a better, safer, more productive and supportive sort of workplace, more supportive workplace than it is today? So I want everyone to sort of, think through what that looks like for them. And then what I'm going to do is have everyone, we have a poll. I use this polling technology called Mentimeter. So basically what you'll do is I usually use my phone, but you could use your computer as well. And you just go to www.menti.com. And there's a location you could put in a code. And so the code, and Ricky's going to put it in the chat for everyone, is 575475. And the code, when you get into the actual online thing for Mentimeter, there'll be 3 spaces for words. So if you can just include some of the words that really represent your future workplace and some of the things that you see in that vision. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that, and I'll sort of do it along with you. So sorry, I don't know if everyone could hear. I have my neighbors doing a little bit of renovation. So hopefully, Ricky, is it coming through really loudly?
Not very loudly. No.
Okay, good. It's bad for me, but not for you, which is good. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the next slide because it's going to come up as a word cloud, and we'll be able to sort of see what everybody's put in. And obviously, as most people know how word clouds work, the more common words that come up will be bigger than the smaller words. So it's a really nice way to see what everyone sort of envisions as that workplace, that better workplace of the future. Flexible is coming up a lot. I think what we've learned over the last few months is that more flexibility is possible. I think we know, up before the pandemic, we know that there was a lot of companies already moving towards a more flexible workplace model. But some weren't. And I think, what we've learned is that the technology has always existed for us to be able to work more flexibly. It was really more traditional kind of mentality about work. You got to be at work and see people to know people are doing work, or more cultural issues that were keeping people from sort of moving there as well. So knowing that it's possible is great. So technology, joyful, I love that word. How do we create more sort of purpose-driven work where we're productive and happy at the same time? Compassionate, open to new ideas, home equipment provided. Yes, that's a really good one. Now that we're working from home, what's going to be, how are companies going to be, or organizations going to be making sure we have the tools that we need? So I could actually see here how many people. So 27 people have. How many people do we have here, Ricky? Just so I know what the participation.
About 75.
75. Okay. So I'll wait a few more seconds to get a few more people in here. So we have 27. So maybe we'll wait till we get to at least 30. But I think it's a really important activity, when we're talking about reimagining the workplace, instead of just talking about, what are the current issues and what are the gaps, it's really, let's put on our, vision hats and think, well, what is the ideal? And then we could talk about, okay, well, how far are we from there? And how do we get there? And I think it's a really nice sort of place to start the discussion. Okay, so let me just see here before we move on. So we're still at 27. We're at 28. Thank you. So I'm going to move on, but this, feel free to keep responding. I could go back later to see if we got any more responses, but thank you everyone for participating in that. So let's talk about sort of where we are today. So obviously the pandemic has brought extraordinary change to how we work. This is some data that PwC collected in their recent Workforce of the Future survey. The dark red, the 82%, is pre-pandemic, the percentage of people who worked externally in an office. And then that light pink here, the 6%, is the number of people who worked primarily remote, with sort of the maroon 12% people who work mixed. And you could sort of see how that changed post-pandemic. The pink is now 60% of people are primarily working remotely. And we went from 82% of people working in the office, just 27% of people work in the office, literally like that. And I always sort of say, I've been helping organizations drive change initiatives my whole career. Implementing new technology, changing behavior, changing, strategic direction and this type of thing. And I have never seen, this side of how quickly organizations were able to accommodate all of this change so quickly and change just the day-to-day behaviors. And now, post-pandemic, I have this great case that I could say, it really is, anyone can change. It's the will to do it. And, we've seen what we can do. So it really has been an extraordinary shift. What else has come with this? Obviously, working from home means for a lot of people more working hours. I think that there's been early in the pandemic, we saw parents were actually struggling a little bit with this because there was demands at home. But I think for, now that kids are back in school, or at least most kids are back in school, I think, we know when people are working remotely, people tend to work more. On the one hand, there's no environmental kind of cues to tell you when the end of the day is. So you might end up, responding to email sort of at all hours of the day, but also just those sort of informal conversations that you have in the office, those aren't happening. So you're just kind of working through it all. And so that's definitely a change that we've seen. And also increases in social isolation. Our social, human beings are social animals. Going into the workplace gives us that level of social support that helps to buffer really kind of stressful work environments, and not having that has led to more social isolation, as well as just the literal, we cannot see as many of our social networks as we could before. And this also, we've seen increases in stress, burnout, and uncertainty through the pandemic. I think there was a recent survey by the Canadian Mental Health Commission that 84% of Canadians they surveyed said they had an increase in sort of mental strain since the beginning of the pandemic. And Morneau Chappelle reported that the Canadian working population is just as distressed as the 1% highest distressed population pre-pandemic. So there's a lot of sort of stress going on, both, from obviously the pandemic and the uncertainty of the future, but also from this significant change of operating that we've been doing. And I think, like many people have discussed, the pandemic has obviously highlighted a lot of inequities in the workplace. So from a gender perspective, we know a lot of the people who were working in more frontline service jobs tend to be more women. So we've seen a lowering of female employment. I saw a stat that said we're down to 55% female employment, which is the same rate we had in 1986. Also from a racial and income perspective, again, we started to see sort of the inequities where people in higher income jobs were able to work from home and sort of maintain, their day-to-day. People in sort of lower income jobs and potentially, we see that sort of service work sitting in that category where you might see more racialized communities being either having higher job insecurity or being more at risk, working sort of front lines and being out there and more at risk. So seeing those divides in regards to how we as organizations sort of manage where we put people and what positions we put people in, and this type of thing. So we know that that's happening in the pandemic, but we also know that these problems existed before the pandemic. So in 2018, Deloitte did a burnout survey, found 77% of the people they surveyed had burned out on the job. We also know that 50% of Canadians have reported that the workplace is, the biggest stressor of their day, and it's something that causes people a lot of anxiety. We also know 60% of Canadian workers have had experience with mental illness. There's research that shows that obviously service workers and workers in lower income brackets, but also millennials are at higher risk of mental strain and mental illness. And we know that people who do have a mental illness, I think the Canadian Mental Health Commission said 43% of people with a mental illness cite the workplace as a significant contributor to it. We also know that work has become more unstable and precarious. 40% of workers in GTA are considered precarious or unstable. That means more contract work, less predictable schedules, no benefits. This type of movement towards this, loose connection between you and the organization has really, created a more stressful, uncertain, almost a lot of financial insecurity and job insecurity in this kind of environment around how we work. And we also know that, a lot of the mental strain and well-being and the impacts to our well-being of the culture of how we work and some of the decisions that are being made around how we manage organizations, not only does it affect our mental health, but it affects our physical health as well. So this is a data point from the Canadian Mental Health Commission around, I think this is from 2014, that 63% of physicians were seeing growing levels of stress disorders and anxiety. But there's also been research in the US done. There's a fellow at Stanford University by the name of Jeffrey Pfeiffer who wrote a book called Dying for a Paycheck. And he basically did a research on a variety of toxic workplace practices and the impact on the American healthcare system, and found that 5 to 8% of their healthcare costs in the US are sort of caused by these toxic workplace practices that are sort of manifesting in physical, visits to the doctor and all these sort of physical ailments that come out from mental stress and strain. So, the big takeaway from this is status quo was not working. We already knew people were feeling stressed, anxious. We knew that work was becoming, putting more pressure on us with the rise of sort of digital and technology, being able to shut off and take breaks and re-energize. That time was getting sort of pressured and we're sort of getting pushed in a little bit. So we already knew this was a problem. And I think, the pandemic with its uncertainty, although it added to it, I think it just highlighted problems that were already there. So this is just some examples of some of the headlines we've seen, even, working up to the pandemic around precarious work and its impact for millennials, burnout as a health crisis. But we also know that it's affecting organizations' bottom line. Everyone probably has heard about sort of Uber a few years ago in the news. Their toxic workplace culture was coming out. It was doing a real hit to their company brand. And they lost money for it. It hit their bottom line. It isn't just a nice to have. Let's just be supportive on the side. It's something that you need to do because companies will be held accountable if they're not creating those types of environments. And obviously Amazon as well has had some fairly bad press around their own sort of toxic workplace practices. So I think it's really important to see that the pandemic has shown us that, it's time that we invest and put in some intentional work in how do we create more supportive and compassionate and psychologically safe workplaces, and how do we balance that thinking with the need for productivity. I think we're here where productivity is here and support is here. How do we get to here and maybe even there? So I think that's sort of the work that we need to do. And so the question then becomes, well, why has work become so much more stressful? There's probably, there's a variety of reasons why. It's a really great research question. I think that I mentioned early on that, technology has obviously played a role. But, when we look at sort of core management practices, so my training is in industrial and organizational psychology, and industrial and organizational psychology is the study of what motivates people. And a lot of sort of the common management practices are really rooted in a lot of the research that's been done since the 50s and 60s and 70s around good management practices. But work was really different then. So work was place-based. You went into the office, you did your job, you left. It was process work. So it was more routine work than it is today. There was also more of a, work was, you got a job with a company and you stayed forever. It was just a different place. And work was really more focused on productivity, predictable work, and performance outcomes. So you often hear people I come from management consulting is, how much is it, the widget, how much, does it take to make the widget? And it really was about counting widgets. And work is different today. Work is technology enabled. We can work anywhere, anytime. It's outcome focused. So it doesn't matter necessarily the process you're doing to do your work. It's, are you creating the outcome that is expected of you, which is very different than just sort of counting the widgets. And today's work is more creative, it's more complex, it's more cognitive, and it requires more empathy. That's why you're seeing like the rise of, the human-centered design work and all this type of stuff. It's really about how do we think more strategically, and in a world where our work is strategic and creative and cognitive, how we manage needs to protect and needs to be able to foster a safe place for us to be able to think in these ways and to perform in these ways over the long term. So as I said, I think the pandemic has shown really clearly to a lot of organizations, and even for me personally, I've been talking about supportive, compassionate, psychologically safe management practice for a long time, but I've never seen the sort of demand for, okay, we actually need to talk about how can we manage our workplace in a more compassionate way. And I think, there's a really great opportunity to say, okay, so how can we get better moving forward? So before we get into, I want to talk about psychological safety, but I just quickly wanted to just kind of share with the group what are some of the things we know from a management workplace culture perspective that we know drive sort of these high stress, sort of toxic kind of work environments that could potentially risk sort of burnout and these types of things. So we know that sort of prolonged stress without needed recovery time. So without people who are sort of working, who continue to sort of face stressful environments without the time to step back to re-energize, this could sort of lead to burnout. We also know that there are elements of individual differences that will make someone might be more impacted by a stressful work environment than another person. So we know people who are more type A might have, more propensity to feel kind of this high stress, but generally, there's a lot more sort of in the environment that is important to focus on, because this is where we can start to sort of pull levers and change things. And one of the biggest sort of theories or models around burnout and stress in the workplace is they call it the demand resource model. So it's really the idea of how do we balance the work demands that are coming towards, like, that we're dealing with the resources that we have access to. And I think, when someone thinks of, well, resources, well, I just need more time or more money, and that's going to make, and that's the only thing that could sort of fix the issue. But I think what we know is that there's a variety of resources in the workplace, especially from a management perspective, that we know can buffer the negative effects of highly demanding and highly sort of high stress work environment. I think right now in the pandemic, there is stress, there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of things coming our way. And so the idea is, how do you create an environment that helps people in that environment better sort of manage those things, and those demands don't weigh as hard on sort of our minds and our shoulders. So if you look at sort of the demands list, there's some common demands that we all know. So high workload, long hours, uncertainty, emotional labor. I think that's a really important one for people who are working in sort of service jobs, in the service sector. You see a lot of that where empathy and managing your emotions is a requirement of your job. Teachers, nurses have a significant amount of emotional labor that they have to manage on a day-to-day. That is a stressor. That is a demand on our well-being, on our mental health. And these things are in our jobs, and in many cases, they're unavoidable things. So the question is, what are the resources we have access to? So what we do know is that there's a variety of levers we can pull. So the first is your relationship with your direct supervisor. This is one of the most important buffers that we've seen in high stress work environments, and is having that positive relationship with your direct supervisor. They always say people leave a boss, they don't leave a company. It's true. The relationship with your leader, being able to speak to them about things that are coming up, having that two-way communication, having that trust plays a huge role in buffering those types of negative impacts. Having a strong social network, so social support. Obviously, right now we don't have access to the same day-to-day social support that we get, but we do know that making sure you are connected to and the organization is providing space for people to kind of connect socially is a significantly important buffer for high stress work environments. And then some of the sort of management basics, just job recognition, feedback, pats on the back for, effort being put in, even constructive feedback. How can you get better at your job? Where can you grow? These types of things reduce people's stress at work. Knowing where you stand is an important thing. And then sometimes when you don't, you can sort of, that adds extra uncertainty to your day-to-day. Clarity in your job. What are your expectations? Having a voice, being able to speak up, have input in the key decisions around your job, also really important in highly stressful work environments. Also, there's been a lot of research on meaning and purpose, or feeling like you're sort of working for your calling. We know that tends to buffer sort of high stress environments and reduces the risk of burnout. Really connecting to that purpose, it tends to be a protective factor. And then also our self-efficacy. So that means sort of our own self-confidence, our own belief in our self-worth, is also a very important sort of resource that we can pull on when we're facing a lot of these sort of stressors. So the question now is, how do we move forward? And I think, this concept of psychological safety, which I'm sure some of you have heard of it, it's sort of a more recent concept. I think pre-psychological safety, most organizations were talking about employee engagement only. And I think understanding sort of the workplace from a psychological safety lens is a really nice way to look at how do we start to address, this high burnout, high stress sort of thing that's happening in the workplaces. So it really was popularized a few years ago through Google. Google had actually done a variety of sort of internal research projects on what makes a successful team. So they looked across all of their teams and they studied any possible predictor of team performance. So they looked at the actual demographic makeup of the team, whether the teams were friends inside and outside of work, who was on the team, were they all the same ages, were they different ages, all these various factors. And what they actually found was this concept that they called psychological safety was the key predictor of team performance. And so how they defined it was it's their norms where people feel in your group or in a team that people feel safe to share ideas, bring up difficult topics, and make mistakes without fear of repercussion. People feel comfortable being vulnerable, asking for help, and taking risks in front of each other. And they also sort of identify this behavior that they called conversational turn taking, where in really successful teams and teams that really worked well together, people tended to all contribute equally. There wasn't sort of one person who was the one who's speaking all the time. If your boss is the one who's always the one talking, you're not necessarily having that sort of positive team environment. It tended to be, or not even necessarily your boss. And what they ended up seeing is that even in teams where sometimes people spoke over each other, that really wasn't as important. It was just that at the end of the day, did everyone have an equal, did everyone contribute equally? And they really saw this as sort of this concept of psychological safety. And obviously it's Google, so they take an innovation approach to it. They say, if people feel safe to speak up, if they feel that they can trust everyone around them, then you're going to have more innovation. But there's also sort of this other side to psychological safety that we say that, the other side of the coin is it will also create sort of, an environment where people can feel safe. People can feel satisfied, but they also feel that their well-being is being protected. So there's been some work done in Canada. There's a national standard for psychological safety, and they take more of a risk management approach to it. So how do organizations actually go out of their way to protect and make efforts to foster and protect well-being of their team? And it also sort of takes more of a team members feel included. They feel they're all treated with equal respect and dignity. And there's sort of this idea of how do we think about psychological safety, just like we would physical safety? How can employers actually take the steps to sort of protect the psychological safety of their teams? So the next question is, so how do we do it? How do organizations create that space where people feel safe to speak up? They feel safe being vulnerable around each other. They could ask hard questions. They could raise their hand and say, hey, I think I have too much on my plate, and not feel like that they're going to feel that they're weak or they're not performing well. How do we create that type of environment? And, I think that we really need to take sort of a multi-level approach. It's not just an organizational responsibility where we need to put in a few organizational policies and that's it. And it's not just an individual level intervention. So it's not just about providing training for individuals on how to manage stress on a day-to-day, how to meditate and all this kind of stuff, which are all important. It's really about making sure we're acting to create sort of that culture of psychological safety. We're actually acting at all levels of the organization, at the individual level, at the management level, and at the organizational level. So what are the types of sort of activities, or what are the types of things we should be looking at doing to ensure we're sort of instilling this culture across the various levels of organizations? Well, at the individual level, I think, it is important to find ways to sort of foster that self-compassion. How do you manage people so that they're focusing more on their strengths? I always talk about my first job was with a large consulting firm, and the way that it was a very much up or out firm. So if you didn't, get promoted in 2 years, you were out. Your performance was evaluated on a ladder, so you were directly competing against your peers, and that really created an environment of fear. So instead of focusing on what am I good at, you're really focusing on, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose my job, or I'm not going to perform well. So how do you start to create a more environment where people have that, are more practicing self-compassion, and they're sort of focusing on those strengths, and also building the skills to practice healthy work habits, establish balance, and ensure flexibility, not only in how we, flexibility around the rules of where work is done and how it's done, but also, for all my fellow perfectionists out there, how do you know when, you can sort of pull back a bit, and how can you be flexible in how you're managing your time, and when you're sort of putting the boundaries up around you and saying, what, today I'm going to just do just this much because I need that for my own health and psychological health and these types of things. And also empowering people with training and skill development is been shown to be very effective in creating sort of that safer environment where you're investing, and people are sort of, always building their skills and this type of thing. And then also providing space for people to support each other, for people to connect, and really build meaningful relationships with their peers, with their team members, with people outside of their team members, and with their manager. Creating those moments where you're just getting to know each other as an individual. And when we talk about at the management level, there's a variety of things you could do, but I just picked a few here. And obviously, how are you ensuring managers are clearly communicating goals and expectations? Obviously, with Zoom and with all, the virtual technology, communication gets a little more complex. Sometimes we have to adjust our communication style based on sort of the mode that we're using. So just, how are we making sure that what we're saying is coming through? Are we having those conversations? Are we checking in? Are we getting people to sort of reiterate, so that there is that common understanding? How are we providing those two-way feedback channels to people? So is there formal and informal ways you're gathering input on, how work is going, so that people, if someone is overloaded, there's a space for them to sort of speak up. And also just having sort of these sort of lesson learned sessions, after big projects, are you getting together and saying, how could we have done things differently? And then obviously from a management perspective, demonstrating vulnerability and modeling curiosity. This in itself is a significant step in showing, that we're all human, and creating that more human-centered environment where, we're taking care of each other, and being able to show your own vulnerability helps to build those positive relationships with your team. And then obviously a very important one is the role of balancing resources and demand. So, how do you ensure that your team has the right resources in order to meet the demands of the job? From, emotional support resources to the skills they need to do their job, to the time and the deadlines they have there to do their job, really looking at sort of making sure that those two things are balanced. And then at the organizational level, again, it's sort of very similar things to the management level, but more sort of formal process things. So making sure there's realistic workforce planning, what work needs to get done, what's the workforce that we need. If we don't have resources to get more work, how do we start to adjust the work coming in, and what our expectations are in the work coming in, so that we can manage the work without burning people out? How are we putting in these informal continuous learning processes? Do people have access to the information that they need to do their job? Technology obviously plays a role here, as well as just ensuring that data is available for people in these types of things. And then looking at sort of your reward and incentive systems. Like I mentioned before, are you rewarding people and evaluating people using sort of Are people being, punished if they're not doing right, or is there more positive reinforcement, more sort of positive reinforcement incentive systems put in place? And then accountability mechanisms. So how are people, who's accountable for creating a psychologically safe environment? Do you know how safe people feel? If you asked people, do you feel safe raising your hand and asking for help? Do you feel that you can brainstorm openly in front of your peers? Do you know what that is? Is there sort of these, right now I know there's a lot of engagement surveys that go out, but maybe we should start asking some of these other questions that really tap into this aspect of psychological safety. So that's a lot. There's a lot of things to do. So where do you start? How do you start to sort of build the culture? If you're, in an organization where it's the first time you're sort of thinking about this and you don't know where to start, a lot of the work I've been doing over the pandemic and even before the pandemic is really just starting a conversation with your team. So create a safe space to come together and say, let's talk about stress at work. Like, what are some of the causes? What have people been feeling? What are some coping mechanisms that other people are using? And just really starting to provide a common language for people to be able to know that it's safe it's okay not to be okay, and to have language to talk about it. Because a lot of times the language isn't there. There's a lot of research that shows there's still a lot of shame in feeling bad at work and feeling strained at work. And because of that, a lot of, we're not solving the problem because people are still afraid to speak up because they're afraid that it shows weakness. And I think, that really needs to change. And also bringing people together. Sometimes this is a us versus them. I've had a few clients where there's kind of managers versus employees. And I really think, the solution to this is we all have to learn how to better balance our work, and we all have to learn to have more self-compassion, and we all have to learn these things. And, if we're all able to sort of individually do these things, then we create that environment where it's safe for everyone to do them as well. So how do we create those spaces where, everyone can come together and learn some of these, practices and skills together? And then also understanding what are some of the things that are happening in your workplace that are driving some of these highly stressful work processes or highly sort of toxic workplace cultural norms. Oftentimes it's not, just one person. Sometimes over time cultures just build and norms just build. So how do you start to really diagnose where the problems are, so you can start to identify sort of the right path forward? So that's my presentation today. I think I'm right on time, Ricky. We're now on to Q&A. I put a question here just to start Q&A, but Ricky, feel free if there's questions already in there. Feel free to share them with me. But if anyone needs sort of a question starter, I'm curious about what practices, everyone in this room has seen that have helped to foster more psychologically safe workplaces. I think a lot of us are learning during this pandemic, and it would be great to even just share some of those practices with each other.
So unfortunately, the audience does not have the ability to talk to each other on this.
I know, sorry.
It is a great question. Nothing has come in yet, so I'd encourage everyone listening. This is now the time to put your question out there in the chat.
I'll leave it here too. This is probably the meteor slide.
I was actually going to lead off with a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So it's a toss-up between two. I think I'll go with the harder one.
Okay.
So I don't think anyone would argue that psychological safety in the workplace is an important matter, and now especially with COVID. But what is the downside? Obviously with anything new, there's always unanticipated negatives, right? And one that I can think of, just the difficulties from a management perspective, being able to prioritize, or even being able to translate some of the feedback, some of the the vulnerability that might come our way, and kind of distinguishing between the noise, what's noise, and what's actually sincere and authentic issues.
Yeah.
So that would be one off the top of my head. But is there what are the downsides that you've come across so far?
I think that there's a fear sometimes that if we start to open up the, floodgates to, caring about how people are feeling, what if it's too much and we can't solve all the problems, right? And I think that that's what you mentioned. And there's also, I've worked with some clients who are afraid that people if we're caring too much about people's well-being, is that counter to productivity, right? Are we going to sacrifice, productivity? And I think that's sort of a very old school way of thinking that the research doesn't support. When people feel safe, and Google's research is really powerful. When people feel safe to speak up, they perform better, especially when now work is more cognitive and creative, right? And I think, in regards to, what if managers aren't psychologists. So I think there's, even the language of psychological safety doesn't mean that managers need to be everyone's psychologist. I think it's just, how do you create an environment where people feel that if there is a problem, they have somewhere to go. And I think there's a lot of organizations that, are so much on this side where productivity is king and everything is king, that doesn't even exist today. So, on the one hand, maybe there's downsides, but I think as a whole, we're way more on the downside of too much on the other side. But, I do think that when when I work with my clients, that one of the first things I talk about is the importance of self-compassion. And it's for managers and for everyone. Like, I think, managers can't create a psychologically safe environment if they themselves aren't creating that psychologically safe environment in their own head for themselves. And I think, when you start to foster that self-compassion, where you inherently know that you're capable, and that things will be tough, but you can deal with it. If you have employees coming to you with a variety of problems, you'll be able to say, listen, like, we need to talk about these issues, but we also, let's figure out how we can sort of, when to sort of move forward, right? You can't solve everything. And I don't think you have to be able to create a psychologically safe environment. It's just about people knowing that they are safe if something comes up, but also respecting that you do care about their well-being. So if as a manager, you have to say, hey, we need to move forward. I know that this is causing you stress. We'll figure it out. Having that sort of trust that, we're moving forward and we're doing the right thing. So that sort of answers your question, but I do think that the risk is more right now, people, not at all thinking about this rather than thinking too much.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. We do have another question, and we probably only have time for this one, but I will put Christine's contact information in the chat window for anybody who may have follow-up questions after the session is over. But Agnes from the city of Barrie is asking, how can we encourage leaders to take care of themselves?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And like I said to you, Ricky, we cannot, when we think about creating psychologically safe workplaces, we have to start with ourselves. And, there's a lot of research on leadership burnout. At one point, me and a few of my colleagues have been talking about doing, a research project where we just have leaders share their stories of burnout, because it's so common, but it's often sort of not talked about. And so I think, one is, having the conversation so people know it's okay to burn out. In a lot of the sessions that I've done, I have a lot of leaders speaking up for their organizations as sort of role models that say, hey, I've experienced this. This is what happened to me, to really start to make it safe for other people to do it. And then providing sort of the tools that leaders need and that individuals need to help sort of establish those practices that they need to take care of themselves. And I think, that is the first step to fostering a psychologically safe environment, is for you yourself to establish healthy work practices and your own sort of, healthy work practices and your own habits in that way.
Awesome. Thank you for the question. Awesome. Well, I put, as I said, Christine's contact info in the chat window, so please do reach out to her with follow-up questions if you have any. I just want to say once again, thank you,